Good evening and welcome on behalf of the Committee of Lectures, the Institute on National Affairs funded by GSB and the Greeley School of Journalism. Before we begin, I'd like to announce a couple of upcoming lectures. On April 8th in the Great Hall of the Memorial Union will be Nadine Strassen. And on April 7th, Barry Lynn will be speaking One Nation Under God, Where to Separate Church from State. Both have been rescheduled due to winter conflicts. And I'd also like to remind everybody that there will be a reception afterwards. And now to announce tonight's speaker, Geneva Overhoser has covered City Hall and state legislator for the Colorado Springs Sun and spent 5 years freelancing from Africa and Europe before running the editorial page at the Des Moines Register, joining the editorial board of the New York Times and becoming editor of the Register, ombudsman at the Washington Post, and a syndicated columnist at the Washington Post Writers Group. Geneva joined the Missouri School of Journalism in September 2000. She has been a regular media commentator, CJR columnist, former congressional fellow, Nieman Fellow, chair of the Pulitzer Prize Board, and an officer of the American Society of Newspaper Editors. She is currently a trustee of the Stanley Foundation Knight Fellowship at Stanford, National Press Foundation, and the Alfred Friendly Press Fellowship. Geneva initiated the challenge to the practice of withholding the names of rape victims in 1989 while serving as editor of the Des Moines Register. The paper won the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service in 1991 for reporting by Jane Shorer that, with consent, named a woman who had been raped. The stories followed an opinion piece Overhoser wrote for the New York Times, also published in the Register, arguing that the practice of suppressing the accuser's name strengthened the stigmatization. Now we'd like to welcome Geneva.
Thanks so much to Kim, who's been an absolutely lovely host, even as she is, an important staffer on the Daily. She has been having to square me around, and I am very grateful indeed. It's been a pleasure. I'm so impressed with so many of the people I have met today, and so delighted to be able to see old friends. I've just had a wonderful day here. Very full, I must say. People have been definitely running me through my paces, but I've been well fed. I've been eating pizza and ice cream, and it is a great treat to be back in Iowa. People always say things like that when they start speeches, but I really mean it. I love coming back to Iowa. It always feels like home. I'm particularly delighted to be here at Iowa State, where I feel I'd love to believe I'm sort of an honorary alumna, and I have certainly spent many happy hours. So it's a great pleasure to be here. I have to say, all these familiar things come flooding back to me. I get in the car and I hear the news about soybean prices, or I hear that last week was funnel week at the Iowa State Legislature, or the girls' basketball tournament is beginning at Veterans Auditorium. I think, oh yes, this is Iowa. So it really is a complete treat to be here, and I want to thank all who have been such warm hosts to me, and to tell you that it is a great honor to be part of this series, and I am particularly pleased that ISU and the Institute on National Affairs have organized a series of speeches on the Bill of Rights. This document has a great deal to do, as you all know, with who we are as a democracy, and it's terribly important to think about it and to think about whether it's under challenge and to think about how we can keep it healthy. You've heard an interesting variety of perspectives on the right to bear arms and on the Patriot Act and on religion and the state. I'm sure many of you have come to various of these. You also have a couple of more interesting ones to come. Nadine Strassen is a friend and a terrific person, and I know that will be an interesting lecture. My topic, Name the Accuser and the Accused, has, I would argue, two strong footholds in the Bill of Rights. One of them, of course, is where you would expect me to cite it in the First Amendment, under the freedom of speech and of the press. And the other one, I think, is in the Sixth, the right to a public trial. Now, I want to begin by inviting you all to think of my speech in terms of concentric circles. I'm going to start by telling you a story that happened here in Iowa a dozen years ago, which Kim alluded to. Then I'm going to tell you what I think that story represented and how it has played out over the years in national policy and journalism discussions, because it has definitely had legs. And finally, I'm going to tell you why I believe the concepts that are represented in that story are important to you and indeed to our democracy. And the final concentric circle extends out to all of you when you tell me what you think and ask me questions that I haven't yet answered. And please, questions on anything, and not just on this topic. And while I say that, I want to say to the students and faculty whom I've spoken with throughout the day, I apologize beforehand. I have a limited number of anecdotes. I'm afraid you will hear some redundancy. So please bear with me. I'm glad some of you are new faces and weren't in the classes I've spoken with today. But first, I want to give you two words that I hope you will bear in mind during this speech. Two concepts that I hope you will carry away with you. One is truth. The other is fairness. Okay, so now to the story. It's 1989. I haven't been editor of the Register very long, maybe 3 months or so, and I'm sitting there in my office on Locust, and it happens that my secretary is away, and the phone rings, and I answer the phone, and a very tearful and scared-sounding voice is on the other end of the phone. Now, some of you in this room have run news desks. Some of you are running news desks right here on the campus. And you know that some of the phone calls you get are kooky phone calls. And kind of depending on your mood, you might do one thing or another with those phone calls. Well, as it happened, this woman this felt like a very powerful phone call to me. And but she wouldn't. She just said, "I want to come see you. Just please let me come see you." And I must say, I didn't ordinarily during this time period when I was running the Register just say, "Oh, sure, just, come pop in. It doesn't matter what you want to talk about." You just can't do that, although you might wish you could. But she obviously had a powerful story to tell, and she wanted to come talk to me, and so I said, fine. She ended up telling me that she had been raped, and she wanted to tell her story. She was a woman in Grinnell, Iowa, a young mother of 2 children named Nancy Ziegenmeyer. And her call had been prompted by a piece that her husband had read. It was an opinion piece that I had written and that was published in the Register. And I want to say just a little bit about that piece because it really sets the stage for this conversation. In 1989, the Florida Supreme Court had made a ruling about a newspaper there that had used a rape victim's name. And they had been sued, and this Florida Supreme Court ruling held that the paper was within its constitutional rights to have used the name of this woman. And I got a phone call one day just after this decision in Florida from the then media reporter of the New York Times, a guy named Alex Jones, who later wrote a book about the New York Times, an interesting book, and is now running the Shorenstein Center at the Kennedy School. But I had known Alex when I was at the New York Times before I came back to the Register to be editor, and I'm pretty sure that why he called me was that he wanted to get a quote from a good feminist editor. There weren't all that many women editors of major newspapers. There still aren't all that many women editors of major newspapers. And I feel pretty sure that what Alex wanted me to do is one of the things that I did do, and that is explain why newspapers have made this exception. And it's important that we remember that we are talking about an exception here. It is the practice of the media generally to name names, even in many cases, as is true, where people would much prefer not to have their name in the newspaper. But in this particular very difficult crime in which people have suffered a particularly cruel crime itself, and then the stigmatization that society, through its ignorance and unfairness, attaches to this crime. Over the years, there had built up a kind of a tacit agreement that women who bring charges of rape would not be named in the newspaper. And I said to Alex that I certainly felt that that was a humane response and that I understood why it happened, but it had always worried me as a journalist what might be the impact of our having made this choice as opposed to any other adult victims of crime. And I couldn't help thinking, I said that in fact this may well contribute to the continuation of the stigma. The idea that women, if they've been raped, ought to be quiet, ought not to talk about it, ought to go off in a corner, that this had enabled us to keep rape in the shadows. It's hard to realize this now, but back in I keep saying saying 1899? I'm feeling very old lately. I just had my 56th birthday. That must be it. Back in 1989, there was very little reporting about rape. And in fact, I think one of the things that happened after this, partly because of this series, there began to be a great deal more coverage. But at this era, there was very little reporting indeed. And I have always felt strongly that the fact that we were not naming rape victims had contributed to the fact that we were not having much coverage of rape. So my comment was printed in the New York Times coverage of this Florida Supreme Court piece. And somebody from the New York Times wrote to ask if I would write an opinion piece on this because it was an unusual opinion. Still is an unusual opinion. And so I thought, well, maybe I should do that because I think it's a question worth considering. I have a great deal of respect for the varying views on this, but I felt strongly that it was a view we ought to consider. What are the effects of our aberrational decision in this regard? So I wrote the piece, and I thought, well, I'm the editor of the Register. I'm not at the Times any longer. I don't want it just to run in the Times. We'll run it in the Register, even though nobody in Iowa will give a damn about this subject. So little did I know what might follow from that. We ran it in the Register. And now we go back to the Ziegenmeyers, who, living in Grinnell, are going through the difficult aftermath of a rape. And Steve Ziegenmeyer read this article in this op-ed piece in the Register and remarked to his wife, Nancy, this lady editor in Des Moines seems to feel sort of as you do, because what Nancy was saying to Steve and to others is that I'm getting told by rape victims counselors and others that I should just be quiet about this, that I can't talk about it because nobody will understand it, things will only get worse for me, and that I really should shut up about it. But I don't want to shut up about it. I think Nancy was experiencing something that all of us have experienced when something awful happens to us. Now, thank God for most people it isn't as awful as rape, but even if your home is broken into, you find yourself wanting to tell people, and then I heard this, and then I felt so. And I think Nancy was experiencing that. I have to say her case was much easier than many people's cases because all she was doing was sitting in a car waiting to take a real estate test, and nobody, even the most misguided of people, could possibly have thought that she had done anything to, quote, ask for it. So she felt strongly she wanted to talk, and she asked us if the Register would tell her story. Well, I told her that we couldn't possibly tell her story until after the trial because it would be prejudicial to the trial, but I said I'd have an editor call her. And I didn't actually pay much attention to any of this during the next several months. We covered the trial just as we would any other very brief coverage, any other trial of its nature. And after it was over, this very talented writer, Jane Shore, produced a remarkable piece of writing that told a very powerful first-person story, essentially. I mean, it wasn't a first-person story, but it was very much the personal story of Nancy Ziegenmeyer. And it started on the first page of the Sunday Register, and it ran for 5 days. Some of you will recall it. It was a remarkable experience. It was a very stark portrayal of this rape, and it was so unusual because this simply was not done. And it had Nancy Ziegenmeyer's name, of course, and her photos, with her urging again. And there was an enormous reaction. The Sunday New York Times put a story on the front of the Sunday Times about this, and just sort of the 15 minutes of fame thing that Andy Warhol alluded to broke loose. We got phone calls from every third-rate radio talk show in the country, and every magazine, and Phil Donahue, and the Today Show, and Won't You Be Esquire's Women We Love. I mean, it was just phenomenal. You see, you begin to realize when something like this happens that so much of press coverage is like little eddies in the wind. It all flows over here, and then it all flows over here, and then it all flows. Well, for that little chunk of time, it was all flowing right there on Locust Street, and eventually the paper was awarded the Pulitzer, and it was a powerful experience. I got to tell you one funny thing before I go on to follow up with the real substance of this, but one of the things that happened, I said everybody called. People wanted to do movies, they wanted to do books. One of the people, we didn't want to do movies and books. We thought we've written this story, that was what we wanted to do. We told a powerful story that doesn't get told often enough, and now we're moving on and doing other things. But, people can do movies if they want to. They can use your name, they can use your logo, they can do anything they want. And one group just said, well, we're moving ahead and we're doing a movie, and the editor is Geneva Overholzer, and the paper is the Des Moines Register, and you can't, keep them from doing that even if you wanted to. So we said, well, so you're doing this. And they sent me the script. They said, well, maybe you'd like to see the script. Well, I mentioned the price of soybeans, right? It's not as if we talk about this all the time in Iowa, as I recall, but sure enough, in the script is this lame scene where I'm presiding over a news meeting, which is in this glass-walled area, which is exactly what it looked like at the time at the Register. And I look out across the newsroom, and here comes Nancy Ziegenmeyer walking into the newsroom. Nothing like this ever happened. And I turn to my staff and I say, stuff the soybeans, gentlemen. We've got a hell of a story. This was the script of this movie. My staff later gave me a shirt. Duffy drew this thing, and me sitting there going, stuff the soybeans, gentlemen. Anyway, they mercifully took this line out of the movie, but the movie ran. It's still on. People will call me and say, there's this really weird movie on. This person says, I'm Geneva Overholser, It's not a common name. Anyway, the movie was no good, but the story was powerful. And I think what we were doing was telling an underreported story, which is one of the most important things you can do in journalism. I felt that we could do that precisely because we had a woman who was as brave as Nancy Ziegenmeyer was and willing to be named. But I did not feel that the main thing we were doing was addressing this journalistic question of, now everybody should name the rape victims. And indeed, the Register did not, except with women's consent. But the big national debate that ensued tended to focus on this question. And partly that happened because there was another famous rape case, which now kind of brings us to, if you think today about the Kobe Bryant case, it recalls in many ways this case of William Kennedy Smith, who was a young, scion of the Kennedy family, who was charged with rape by a woman named Patricia Bowman, who later came out publicly and identified herself. But for a while she appeared behind a blue blob on the television screen. And this case was very much a public thing, and it came right after our series was awarded the Pulitzer. So there was a lot of painful discussion, and I think, and Michael Gartner, whom many of us know and love, and many of us know and don't love, I know, who was a predecessor of mine as editor at the Register, was at that time president of NBC News, and he decided that, boy, not only was I right, but he was really going to do it. So he just started, he named her, and he showed her, and all hell broke loose, and I think, in fact, to the degree that change was coming, it was actually set back by the harshness of that change. We never intended to sort of out all rape victims, and we, in fact, adopted a fairly conservative practice of asking rape victims if they were willing to be named, and if they weren't, we didn't name them. We did, however, fight for open records, and interestingly enough, one of your previous speakers, Kane Robinson, was a principal opponent of mine in this fight. He was the deputy police chief in Des Moines at the time, I believe was his title. And after our series ran, some rape victims, counselors and rape victims, were concerned and alarmed that we were suddenly going to, out everybody. And they went to the police department and demanded that rape victims' names not any longer be on the public records, which is blatantly unconstitutional, and in my view, and I think in many people's views. And so we sued to keep the records open. But when I was on WOI this morning, and somebody called in who was a legislator at that time and reminded me, I'd forgotten this, it actually went to the legislature. There was an attempt to take, to really kind of close the book. Since then, I'm afraid lots of these freedom of information issues have proceeded to be successful, and I think we should be deeply concerned about that. Whatever we think about newspapers' use of information, the question of public records is an terribly important point for all of us as citizens in a democracy. So now we bring the storyline up to the present. The Kobe Bryant case has once again thrust this issue of naming names into the public eye. Believe it or not, during the past 12 years, I have succeeded in living my life without talking about this exceedingly difficult issue. And I was very tempted to continue down that path. But this is a very important and difficult case and has raised the whole issue again very publicly. And I think it's time to have the discussion anew. You know the drill. Kobe Bryant, a very famous man. It's a small town. Certainly people in the town know the woman's name. Somebody on the radio this morning kept saying, you keep referring to him as Kobe Bryant and the woman as the woman. I personally have never made a point of looking up her name, although it's all over the web. And I think if I were to make a point of using her name now, it would sort of be to participate rather aggressively in this outing. So I simply haven't looked it up. I don't know her name, but the point is that we have a celebrity and a woman who is clearly not a celebrity, and it's a rather unsavory case. And people have asked me recently if I really feel the same way that I felt a dozen years ago. Do I feel the same things I thought then? My answer is I do, and I feel them even more strongly. I think we should be naming rape victims. Why? I want to take you back to those two words, truth and fairness. Truth, candor. I still believe that openness requires us to name names, and that in the end both the public and even individuals, which I know is a much harder case to make, are better off when their names are out in the open. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. I believe it deep in my bones. And if we are worried about what people closest to us think, we must remember that the people closest to us are the people who are likeliest to know entirely without the media. In the small town of Eagle, Colorado, where this woman lives, I assure you that it made no difference whether the Rocky Mountain News or the Denver Post, who are very proud not to have used her name, used it or not. People knew. But something has changed since the Ziegenmeier case, and it's the reason that I decided I did want to speak about this again. The mainstream media are no longer the gatekeepers they once were. When we did that series on Nancy Ziegenmeier, and then the Patricia Bowman, William Kennedy Smith case broke, it really did make a difference whether the New York Times and the Washington Post and the major metros like Des Moines and the broadcast networks used her name or not. Now, it absolutely does not. You simply cannot control the information the way you could then, largely because of the web, also because of radio's very different nature. And I'm not talking here about, oh, you're saying that some unsavory characters use it, so others should. I'm saying that it is everywhere amongst us, and it is a conceit to say we're going to protect this woman by not using her name. Some of the very media who are proud of themselves for not using her name have written really fairly scurrilous stories about her, allowing friends to raise past issues of promiscuity. And I think these media have nothing to be proud of. Meanwhile, you get shock jocks and the worst sort of netherworld of the net that are dealing in all this and get to sort of look like they're the champions of freedom. You know, we are fair. We're telling the truth where other media fear to tread. My feeling strongly is that there is a necessary target for all this energy, but the target is responsible coverage of rape. We need to worry terribly about whether people are treated fairly in the media. But to say that we are protecting them by withholding their names is a pretty lame and no longer practicable response, in my view. But now I want to concentrate on this additional word, fairness. Over the intervening years from that Des Moines Register story, when I really felt most strongly about openness and the fact that we were making an exception and that we're really not smart enough in the media to choose which crimes to make this exception on, except when it comes to children, where I think we clearly bear a special responsibility, I have actually grown far more concerned about fairness. Remember, we are talking here about one person charging another with a heinous crime. And I want to say right off the bat, I do not for a minute espouse the view that lots of women are running around frivolously making rape charges. It's just way too horrible an issue. Nobody wants to have anything to do with this. With very few exceptions, I do not think that's happening. But it is horrible to be accused of rape as well. And it is absolutely incorrect for the media to make a choice about the validity or the accuracy of the charge, which is what we're doing when we protect one person involved and not the other. When one person accuses another of a crime, it is, and by all rights should be, a public act. In the case of rape, we make one half public, the person who is accused. This, let me remind you, is before any criminal finding. It's before the courts have spoken, before the public trial, before the jury of your peers. I mean, do we believe that one is innocent until proven guilty or not? Because we in the media have decided one party deserves protection and the other does not. And this has real effect on people's lives. Now, if there is a list of principles that are critical to the health of the media, surely truth-telling and fairness would be high on that list. When the media know things, it is the media's responsibility to share them with democratic citizens, with very few exceptions. Life and death cases, protecting children, these exceptions exist. Beyond that, we should not trust the media to be wise enough to slice these fine hairs. There is a lot of pressure not to say things. People would rather not have all kinds of things in the newspaper. People, for decades, didn't want to have cancer as a cause of death in the newspaper because there was a stigma attached to it. Do you know how that stigma broke down? Because people learned more. They learned that people died from cancer and that there was nothing shameful about it. When I was at the New York Times, they did not list AIDS as a cause of death because of the stigma associated with it. And I happened to be there still when they did list it. I mean, when I first went there, you had all these young men dying of pneumonia. Just amazing. 35-year-old dying of pneumonia. The next day, another 30-year-old man dying of pneumonia. This is not an accurate depiction of the world around us. And all of a sudden, the Times, doing the appropriate thing, began to list accurately the cause of death, and the strangest thing happened. People began to realize this is not some faceless plague striking only a few people. This is real. It's affecting us. You began to hear people say, oh, that talented set designer lost to this tragic disease. It puts a human face. It is part of how we learn about what goes on around us. When I was editor of the Register, I got a phone call every day from somebody who didn't want something in the paper, at least. And those are only the phone calls that have already been dealt with by the folks below, and the people weren't satisfied, so it came all the way to the editor. I was at a dinner party one night. I got a phone call from somebody in Dubuque who was telling me this prominent banker had died in Dubuque, and what the family wanted was to leave out from the list of survivors the name of one brother, because the brother and the deceased had been feuding. So I said, I'm really sorry, but if this is a surviving brother, an obituary is a news story by any other name, and we need to list this survivor. I mean, you begin not to trust the newspaper well, the Dubuque paper, they said, I'm sorry to disparage the Telegraph Herald, but this is what they said, the Dubuque paper was willing to do this. Well, shame on the Dubuque paper, and shame on the Register now, if I may say so, for not having obituaries, which are news stories, and for saying, sure, we're happy to have you mold your own obituary. It is a different thing. Now, it may be fine, and it may be a much happier thing for those who are grieving, but it is not a good thing for society. Now, I know this is not a popular view. I once gave a speech at Stanford called What You Don't Know Will Hurt You. And I said this about cause of death. And I said we need to say suicide when young people kill themselves, because this is part of how we figure out that there is a plague amongst us. And of course, afterward, a man stood up and he said, thank God my local newspaper editor is has more heart than you do, because my stepson killed himself, very talented man, young man, killed himself, and it was terribly grievous for us, and we are very glad that the editor simply said deceased and didn't say the cause of death. And I tried to say, well, obituary is a news story by any other name, this is how we learn, and of course very few people in the crowd were with me, I'm sure. And afterward, in the Q&A time, a young woman came up to me and said, I went to high school with that boy that the father was talking about. And when he killed himself, nobody would talk about it. Nobody would tell us what happened. And I learned two things. One, adults really don't like to confront difficult truths. And two, you can't trust the newspaper to tell them to you. Well, those are not the truths we ought to be telling, and not the truths we ought to be avoiding. And I think that the fact that people don't want news in the newspaper is a fact that is ever with us, but it is not one we should cave into, because when a newspaper withholds information, it weakens its credibility. Anonymity is very much with us. It was at the root of the Jason Blair scandals at the New York Times. When you see something in the newspaper and it has no name attached to it, I think that you feel differently about it. I agree we should protect children, but women, I need not remind you, are not children. And fairness, what could be more important than treating people fairly in the news? It is not up to journalists to decide who is guilty and who is innocent. God forbid it should be. And I am a journalist and a proud one. In closing, I want to say this. I'm not here to persuade you, thank God, because I rarely leave a room feeling I have persuaded any goodly number of people. I have certainly not persuaded many over the years, but I do want to ask you to think about several things. Are we better off with openness? Can we really find protection in secrecy? Do women really benefit from being treated differently? If you were accused of a crime, how would you feel about having your accuser shielded, his name not known, even as your name was in public records, in the university newspaper, say? Do we believe that people are innocent until they're proven guilty? Do we want journalists to treat one party as innocent and one as guilty before that determination is made? I am very worried these days about the fearfulness of our society, that we're more and more willing to give up openness and truth-telling and to cede bits of our commitment to fairness. And I can't help thinking of FDR's words about the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. We have plenty of valid fears these days, of course. Terrorism is no illusion. On a more personal level, for too many women, rape is far from an illusion. But here is the question. Are we better off hiding the truth from ourselves and from others, or arming ourselves with knowledge and acting? Can we really protect ourselves by taking fairness away from someone else? Or are we as a society better off protecting the concept of fairness for all? So there you have it, truth and fairness. And now the last concentric circle at last. You guys have at me. And remember, I would be very pleased to talk about something other than rape victims' names if you're inclined. So thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks a lot. So now some of you, I bet, will impress your professors by asking me scintillating questions. I also am happy to have comments. I see there's a mic, and I'll repeat questions if people can't hear them. Who's the brave beginner? There.
You talk about that the media's job is not to judge which information to withhold and which to report. Don't you think that borders on, what the public's right to know should be?
Actually, I did not. I'm sorry if I said that it's the media's job not to decide which information to withhold and which to report. I think it is very much the media's job. We do withhold children, as I mentioned. We do protect children by not using their names. We clearly withhold some information. I didn't say it's not our job to decide. I said with very few exceptions, we should decide to report. But it's certainly our job to withhold some and to make the decision. I sure don't want anyone else making it for me. I think we should have open records, and I think the media should behave responsibly. I didn't mean to cut you off, though. Did you want to pursue it? Okay, sorry. I'm sorry? Well, I think children are in a very special place in our society. I think children, the newspaper practice has been not to report on children who are victims of crime and also not to report on children who are perpetrators of crime. Obviously, our society has different criminal justice treatment for children. I think we as a society believe in a notion that children should be shielded. They should be able to grow and attain full maturity without having all of the judgments of society down upon their shoulders at an age where they haven't achieved adulthood. I think there's a real distinction between children and adulthood. So that one, to me, is a pretty clean line. Uh-huh. I respect your views on this, and obviously you know a great deal about it, and certainly I've heard this over the years. I think it's dangerous to say that women feel like children and therefore a number of things must follow. I certainly understand that women who have been in this impossible situation need the best of counseling, that we need to worry deeply about the treatment by the police, about the criminal justice system, about how they're reported on. To me, focusing on whether their name is in the newspaper in an era when the name is out, whether people in the newspaper use it or not, and when it's important to remember that the people who know the person do typically know. To me, the naming focus is where the emphasis goes wrong. But I certainly respect your view, and clearly you know a lot about it. Yes.
Do you think if newspapers did report actual names, do you think that would lessen the women who actually do report? Because I know that there's just a survey out about like 1 in every 8 Iowa women are raped, and that's underreported.
You know, that's exactly what made me decide. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. The question is, if we named women in the newspaper, would it reduce the number of reports? Because the number of reports are very low. She was saying she'd read that 1 in 8 Iowa women are raped, and only...
And that's like underreported, and that's not date rape.
Well, it's certainly underreported, yeah. You know, this argument is exactly what made me decide 13, 15, however many years ago it was, that it's important not to do this suddenly, and that we should gradually move toward a time when society itself conceives of this crime more as it conceives of others, when the stigma is gradually reduced, and when therefore it will be less cruel to sort of suddenly identify rape victims. And therefore we and a number of other media began to ask rape victims if they were comfortable being named and using their name. So it was sort of, the philosophy was begin to break it down. I have been told, and it could be that others in the room know this, that in fact many people think the proportion of people today reporting is even lower than it used to be. I really think that a whole lot of things affect people in terms of reporting it. I'd be amazed if this is a huge piece of it, but obviously for each woman it will be a different story. I do have to say there are a lot of things that people will tell you. I mean, I have had phone calls from people telling me that there was a fairly prominent businessman in Des Moines who was arrested for soliciting a prostitute. And all we did in a case like that was list names. We weren't. It's not a big story, but we always at that time, I don't know if they still do, listed it. It was a crime. He was arrested. He was charged. It was listed. His psychiatrist called me and told me he would kill himself if we put his name in the paper. Well, you know, if he'd been poor, he wouldn't have had a psychiatrist to call me and tell me that. It's a very difficult thing, but it's a very tough call, and I don't mean to make light of it. I don't know. It doesn't seem to have worked not to name them. The reporting is extremely low, and so I guess it's hard to make the case either way. Yes. Anyone else? In the back.
What if the woman's still in danger? Like, what if the rapist says he'll keep coming back?
Well, then you should think about that. And if somebody can make that case, that's important. To me, the case could be made in the case of gay bashing or spousal abuse. I mean, I have a problem with a blanket prohibition like this. Again, I don't want to squash the poor young man here who said, you know, the point is I do think we should make these distinctions. And I think a responsible editor makes exactly such a distinction. And I think if that case is a powerful one, then you can make it. But the fact is, the overwhelming percentages of rape are not between strangers. They're by people who know the person. That person is not going to learn in the newspaper where to find the person. This argument is so often made. I mean, we are so ready to go to secrecy, even when it isn't. I mean, even where it really doesn't apply. It might in some cases, and then you should be able to make that case. But I remember when I was here, the Iowa Hospital Association was alarmed by newborn kidnappings of newborns. And so they came to us and they said, we're no longer going to tell you the names of parents, the names and addresses of parents. And we said, because are these kidnapping, we hadn't seen reports of kidnappings from homes, but, so let's sort of investigate this. Well, it turned out the kidnappings were from hospital nurseries. But what their response was, but we got to do something. Well, doing this means, this may seem like a small thing, but this is part of how communities know one another. You read in the paper, oh, look at Jane and Joe, had a little girl, and we can, you can no longer do that. And you might say, well, that's nothing compared to safety, but there was no evidence that it really was creating a lack of safety. We're just willing to sort of jettison this and jettison that. How far down this road are we willing to go? Who else? Yes.
Do you think that there are associated with sexual assault stories, besides the naming of complainants.
Indeed.
And do you feel, one way or the other, that the use of names makes the reporter more responsible because there's a real person?
Well, that's an interesting question. There are often a lot of other issues associated with the reporting of sexual assault. And do I feel that naming the rape victim might make the report more responsible? Lord knows we need to do something to make the report more responsible. I am deeply concerned about the kind of coverage, especially in one of these high-profile cases, that people crawl out of the woodwork to make disparaging remarks about somebody whose only crime that we know of is to bring charges, you know. So, and alas, some media are going to behave like that no matter what you do. I'd like to believe it might in fact be a contribution. It's hard to know. The truth is there is going to be a serious differentiation. And this, I think, is going to be ever more true now with this huge proliferation of media. We're going to have responsible media and not responsible media. And you will vote with your dollars, you know, and your attention. You'll go to media that behave responsibly. And if they're doing titillating, sensational stuff, disparaging people unfairly, then don't go there. And don't buy it. And there is a very great differentiation, as you would agree, no doubt, in terms of ethical behavior on the parts of media. And I know many people think it's a moron to talk, an oxymoron. It's late in my head, I'm sorry, to talk about media ethics. A moron too, I'm sure many people. But there are ethical media. Certainly there are more ethical and less ethical media. And so it makes a difference. And, you know, I think most newspapers reporting on rape would not do this scurrilous stuff, but some do. The Rocky Mountain News, which is a perfectly respectable newspaper, very proud of itself for not naming this rape victim, really ran very early on a story allowing friends to say things that should not be said about somebody's background. I mean, what relevance does it have to the case, you know? That we should be concerned about, and we should complain about it, I think. Yes.
I was just
Thanks for
wondering
having me.
if you'd be at all interested in addressing some of the concerns from smaller media, smaller output of news media, who argue that large newspapers, MSNBC and Time Warner, own these large media outlets and own newspapers, and therefore are able to control the news. I was just wondering if you'd be able to address that issue in any way.
I'm deeply concerned about this. I do think we should be worried about the fact that the media are in the hands of a smaller and smaller number of people. And I think there are considerable effects of that. One of them, I told this story today, and you all may know this, but you know, Clear Channel has just decimated, well, more than decimated, it hasn't climbed a tenth. It has practically destroyed radio news, except for NPR, which is one of the great growth stories of American news reporting. And as they've said to me, it's partly because they could just walk onto a deserted field, you know. We do not have radio news. There's this marvelous anecdote about some small Midwestern city, I'm forgetting which one, which had some kind of dangerous gas explosion. And so people wanted to send word to the radio. It's in these occasions, you know, that you really do turn on the radio. Oh, there's an emergency, you turn on the radio. I mean, I remember during the flood here, how much we were all glued to the radio, you know. Of course, we also really relied on the register during that time. Do you remember? Anyway, the fact is, all 5 of the local radio stations were owned by Clear Channel, and there was not a warm body in the newsroom of any one. So they all prattled on in their pretended local news based out of Dallas or wherever, and there was no way to get the word out. I mean, that's an extreme, but it's only extreme because it's just the radio. I mean, we used to have radio news, you know. We barely do anymore, except for public radio. So that, you know, these FCC cross-ownership rules really made a difference, and you didn't hear a whole lot about it at first because who's going to tell you? If the owners of these companies don't want you to know, trust me, I mean, even as small a thing as being editor of the Register and really, you know, thinking about the news stories that we ought to be writing about, you know, we're raising advertising costs and we're slashing circulation. This is an interesting news story. If it were somebody else's business, I would want a reporter to write it. I'm telling you, corporate owners are not interested in having that be the lead business story. And I think this is worrisome, and the fact that you didn't know enough about the FCC cross-ownership rules changes until, and this is the great joy of this, democratization of the web. It just started, people started talking to one another, and organizations sent word around, and then they pressured Congress. Of course, it's still not really come to a happy ending, but I like thinking that people are going to do this. But yeah, I think we should be concerned about it. I'm part of a coalition that's attempting to do research that shows links between good business and good journalism, because, I like to believe people actually want to read substantial newspapers and see responsible news programs on the tube. But when you got to return 40% net income before taxes, as a lot of television stations do, and worse or better, depending on your viewpoint, you can't have a good news report. And the main answer to this, but come on, we got more media than we need. They're all over the place, this great proliferation. I mean, there are two answers. One is, it's true today. If you want to be well informed, you can be better informed than you ever were in the past. You can go online and read Le Monde and read The Guardian, and you can, listen to the BBC on your local television station, and you get the New York Times delivered to your home and the Wall Street Journal. You can be really well informed. But for the average person reading one of America's 1,500 daily newspapers, and the average person watching a daily newscast on broadcast TV, are they better informed? No. And that is because all of those news organizations, almost all of them, are being squeezed so much that the original reporting, which is a very expensive thing, is just not getting done. And that we should worry about a whole lot. Yes.